So this is one of the science use cases. This is work that I do with a group at NCSA, working on our computer theta at Argonne, but they've also run on Blue Waters at NCSA as well. And this is just kind of a fun example of what we can do with deep learning in the area of astrophysics. Okay. So deep learning is making a huge impact in cosmology and astronomy and in all science domains in general. So I think some of these big data challenges that we see in astronomy are common to every field, but I just kind of wanted to list them. So people think about big data, it doesn't necessarily mean big data, but it is definitely up there, right? Now we're dealing with gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, exabytes of data. So one of the big surveys which is going to be coming online soon is this Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, or the LSST. And we're expecting this to be gathering, terabytes of data every night. Okay, this is basically surveying the sky. It's going to be taking images of galaxies. It's going to be taking images of transients against the sky. It's going to be taking images of supernova, stars exploding. And so this is a huge amount of data, right? It's also recording a lot of garbage, a lot of noise. And so we need to not only take this in, but process it, and then send it out as rapidly as possible to all the facilitating sites here, right, for different collaborative work groups. And the LSST data facility is actually at Urbana-Champaign in Illinois. So for me, when I think about big data in science, it means the volume, but it also means the complexity of the data set, the rate at which it's coming in, right? So we have these massive data sets coming in real time, and we need to extract knowledge from them or filter out noise. It can also mean something like big data visualization, right? And I think this is becoming increasingly important. We need to look at the output from what our models are predicting. And so in order to answer all of these challenges, we really need some hardware and software design. So where are we seeing deep learning in cosmology and astronomy? So we're seeing it in mock catalog creation, right? We need to create mock catalogs so we can basically give them to the different working groups and they can test out their models, right? They can test out the different theories on that data set. We're seeing it to augment M-body simulations. So people run very large M-body simulations where you're basically simulating the entire universe from a very, very early time until today, and hoping that you can replicate the distribution of galaxies that we see on very large scales. We're seeing deep learning to detect gravitational lenses in images. We're seeing it to detect gravitational waves in real time, to classify galaxy images, and to do parameter estimation from time series data. So these last three are what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Okay, so these are real images of galaxies taken from the Sloan Digital Sky Survey Telescope. So quite an old survey now, if you think about it. So the images here on your left are of elliptical galaxies. On the right are spiral galaxies. Right? And so back in the day, what we did, we had so many of these images that we actually couldn't expend PhD students asking them to classify them. So what we did was we appealed to the public, and we started this project called Galaxy Zoo, where we asked members of the public to log on, and we gave them a little bit of training, right? It's not easy, it's not difficult to tell the difference between these two, right? We can do it pretty quickly. Can you just click and tell us spiral, elliptical, unsure, spiral, elliptical, right? And so thousands of people did this, and they ended up giving us a gold sample, right, to train neural networks with. And so this is what we've done recently. So this is deep transfer learning to classify galaxy images using that Galaxy Zoo training set, right? Using the data set given to us by members of the public. So in this project, this is an example of transfer learning where we actually took the exception model, right? One of those famous image classification networks, with weights pre-trained on ImageNet. So it was already pretty good at filtering out things like edges and curves and circles and things like that. And we added on a few custom-defined layers. So now what we're doing is we're taking that exception network and using it as a feature extractor and then passing it through different fully connected layers in order to basically do this binary classification of spiral or elliptical types. Okay. And in this method, what we did was we progressively unfroze earlier layers in the network to fine-tune their weights. So in the beginning, we just want to fix those earlier layers and allow it to be a feature extractor, and allow the deep layers to do some classification. So these images here, I'm going to show you a nice movie that we made of the network as it's learning. So in this movie that I'm going to show, what we're outputting is the second to last layer activation values. As the network is being trained, we took test images of a spiral and elliptical galaxy, and we asked the network, tell us what you think it is. Okay. So I'm going to show a movie of the network doing this. One of the things we then did was that second to last layer is over 1,000 outputs. What we did was we condensed it down using the t-SNE algorithm into a three-dimensional representation. We wanted to see what has the network learned. It's clearly learned to distinguish these two types of galaxies, but can we represent this in a three-dimensional way, right? And so the output from t-SNE was pretty interesting to us. It showed two very distinct groups here of yellow and blue, which we later checked correspond to what the network had clumped together as spiral and elliptical galaxies. Okay. So the kind of cool thing is, now that we have this very clear distinction in three-dimensional space of what the network has learned, right, from an image, now we can take an unlabeled image, right, something that wasn't in Galaxy Zoo in future surveys. We can run it through the network, say, in its three-dimensional representation, where does it fall? And now we have a classification algorithm for unlabeled data sets. And this solves a huge problem, right? Because if you ask anyone in classification, the problem is always, how do we get enough labeled training sets? So this method shows you that you can leverage those training, or sometimes, hopefully, you can leverage those labeled training sets to generate some kind of representation to be used on unlabeled images. Right? And then it's pretty powerful. Okay. One of the other cool things that we did here, so I want to show you again an example of some spiral galaxies and some elliptical galaxies. These are different test sets, right, that we gave the network. So here, this one test set, you can see a clear distinction. Blue are the spiral galaxies, red are the elliptical. A different test set here, and then an unlabeled test set, right? It still classifies them according to two groups. One of the really cool things that we noticed from this visualization, because I really like this idea of visualizing what your network has done or what it's told you. So here you can clearly see much bigger variance in the black dots compared to the red. Can anyone take a guess as to why the network found that? The black dots correspond to spiral galaxies and the red dots correspond to ellipticals. Yeah?
Just to guess, is it the chirality of spirals?
The chirality of spirals?
Clarity.
Hmm?
You said clarity?
Chirality.
Oh.
Right-handed, like clockwise or clockwise.
So yeah, you're getting at it. So I mean, from a very, very basic standpoint, all of those elliptical images look the same. Right? So what the network has actually found is that there's a much greater variation in how a spiral can look compared to an elliptical, right? Which is really nice, right? That confirms what we would have expected. Okay, so now it's time for the cool movie. Okay, so this is two test images that we gave the network as it was being trained. And this is the second to last layer output. So at the 0th epoch, all the base layers are frozen, and it's just those fully connected layers. So the base layers are being used as a feature extractor. The output in the beginning for the two images are similar, which is what we'd expect, just kind of random initialization as it starts to learn. As we go forward, we start to see some differentiation here. It's actually as one of the layers are unfrozen, in the 5th to 10th epoch, some of these base layers are unfrozen, we see a very large response of the network to the spiral image, right? So this is nice because it's showing what layers are responsible for distinguishing important features in the spiral images compared to the elliptical, right? So now you can actually target some of those hidden layers. Yeah?
I'm just curious, how was the visualization done? What software framework?
This is in Visit. Yeah. So this is showing the two together superimposed during training, just to highlight those differences, as you can see. So you can always do this with your network, right? There was no need to do this in 3D, but you can always just do this in Python. Just visualize those outputs and see if it's giving you something interesting. So the very end of training, when everything's converged, we're just going to expand out that final layer and actually see the differences. So this is the one network, right? It's just how the activation, how the neurons are responding to the two different images. And you can clearly see those neurons are responding very differently to those two images, right? Those are just two images from the test set, and then this is the full three-dimensional representation of those images. So now we're just taking a look around, and we'll actually go back and superimpose the real images from the telescope on these points. So you can see the spirals in one clump and the ellipticals in another. So now you can actually see, these are the real images of the telescopes that the classifier has clumped together. There are all the ellipticals, and then we go over and see some of the spirals. Okay. Okay, so that was one application. Okay, so on to fun movie number 2. So another thing we're doing with this group is we're taking time series data, either simulate. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, in your representation, your 3D representation,
Yeah.
is the locality important? Like the ones that are close to each other means that they kind of look similar, and the ones that are
In a sense, yes, but in another sense, no. So if you're familiar with t-SNE, t-SNE can find pseudo-minimum of the representation. So depending on the random seed you run with, you can get a different clumping of those.
okay.
But the point is, no matter how many times you run t-SNE, those two always form two separate clumps. The actual way those two clumps look is different. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Yeah.
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 It doesn't tell you anything about the actual shape of the. Like, I mean, the distribution among this doesn't give you.
No. So in a way it does and it doesn't. So I wouldn't. So you can find different clumps, right? Those clumps we always see, no matter how we run t-SNE. The variance of those clumps we are very consistent between runs of t-SNE, but the actual shapes can vary. There. Yeah. Yeah.
I got a question on the previous animation where you had these spikes. So if I understand correctly, you have the trained network and you give an image for inference, and you see how the activation spike at each layer.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
At the second to last layer only.
yeah. So how do you use this information? Is it to prove the networks further to be more compact, or how do you use information further for at least efficiency or science? I'm just curious.
So how are we using the output there?
Yeah.
So at each layer, right, it's just the output of the activation function, right, whether it activates or not. And then in the last sequence, I show a 3D representation of that after the network is fully trained, right? And now the 3D representation of that to all the test images, we see two distinct clumps, right? So now this is a 3D representation of how the network is classifying those test images in 3D space.
So I was more confused about the previous one before that, where you just saw these spiking as inference. So
Yeah.
that's what you use to create the t-SNE plot, or is it?
That's what we use to make the t-SNE plot. But also, if you don't want to, if it's clear to you that it benefits the t-SNE plot, just looking at those activation outputs themselves, seeing we're seeing that during training, right? It's just one single layer output during training. When we see huge differences like that, when we unfreeze those layers, then we're clearly identifying the unfrozen layers with being able to distinguish certain features in one of the classes, right? So it really helps interpretability here. So now it's no longer just a deep network and we don't know what's going on at each of the layers. Now we can point and say, well, layer number 3 is important for identifying spiral arms, right?
So technically you can build a more parsimonious representation with that information, right?
Yeah, exactly. That would definitely help if you wanted to domain engineer one of those layers. It would really, really help. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
On the first movie, I thought I saw that there was the blue and the yellow, and then they switched in terms of the magnitude. But I was not
They
sure.
switched.
Well, I saw the blue as the high amplitude, and then yellow below,
Yeah.
and then I saw blue and yellow.
So those are just the activation outputs during different stages of training. Yeah. To those particular test images. If you gave it different test images, right, you would see some variation in those spikes, but ultimately not much variation, because then when you go to the 3D representation, they form two clusters. So overall, how the network responds to those two different classes is very distinguished, very different. Okay, so the next project we're working with on this group are gravitational wave detection in real time. So when we have very large astronomical objects out in the universe, like black holes, and they come too close to one another, then what happens is they in-spiral, and just due to the gravitational attraction, they actually collide and then merge. And so we recently detected these. So in 2017, the detection of the first gravitational waves won the Nobel Prize for Physics. We've since then discovered a handful more of these gravitational wave signals coming to us, and we're going to be discovering a lot more. So the instruments LIGO and Virgo are currently offline, and when they come back online, this is going to be kind of the new frontier in cosmology, is measuring these signals. So I just want to show how this group are using real-time data, right? And they're also using simulated data in order to train a deep neural network, so we can predict the event, right? So this is another movie I'm going to show you here, but I'll just talk you through what we're showing. So here is just an artist's rendition of these two black holes as they spiral around towards one another and eventually merge, and then what's called ring down, right? So the fabric of space-time just kind of oscillates as the two merge, right? And that oscillation is the gravitational wave that we detect, right? So here shown in gray in the top panel is the real data, right? The real data from the LIGO interferometer that we measured from the very first event. So this is one of the ones that won the Nobel Prize for Physics. The noise on the signal is in gray here. And the actual signal of the event, right, those ripples in the fabric of space-time is in gray, or is in green. So when we say the noise, in this type of detection, the noise is literally everything else in the universe, right? So this is why many people, they stake their reputation on saying we will never detect gravitational waves because the signal is just too small. Okay, so you have to filter out all this noise. But we've shown that this is doable. So what you're going to see in this movie is as the two spiral in towards one another, the signal is coming towards Earth, and we're going to see this panel. Down on the bottom here is the output from a neural network, which has been trained on simulated data. So the neural network, you're going to see these shallow convolutional layers. They're actually the ones filtering the noise, right? And then these lower layers, as we get to the signal, and as we actually feed the signal itself through the network, it's the lower layers which will start firing up. And we're just asking this network a simple binary question. Have you detected a gravitational wave or have you not? And so you'll see on the bottom here, gravitational wave not detected or detected. Okay. So here, this is the information being fed into the network at this time. So these two objects are getting close to one another, but they haven't yet merged. They're about to merge, so you can see this. They're getting so close that they actually are disturbing space-time. So there are some tiny gravitational waves, and as we actually feed the main signal through, these fully connected layers start firing up here. And this is when the network decides, hey, I've detected a gravitational wave. So very simple visualization again, but again, it really helps us understand, well, what are those convolutional layers doing? Right? They're actually filtering out a lot of signal there. Okay. Okay, so the other thing we can do is we can take this data set, and instead of just asking a network, well, did you detect a gravitational wave or did you not? We can ask it, well, can you actually tell us, based on that time series data, what the mass of the two progenitors were, right? So black holes are pretty simple objects, okay? And so we can ask it, what were the masses of the two objects and what were the spins of the two objects? And so in this second example, or this third example now, this is exactly what we're doing. We're using 3,000 simulated waveforms, right? Because we don't have that number of real data sets of mergers, so we have to use a lot of simulated waveforms. But we've enhanced this data set by adding different things we know to be true, right? So there's got to be time invariance in that data set, right? We don't know where in the stream that actual gravitational wave signal will come. We've also added different ranges of signal to noise, right? Based on its distance from Earth, right? That signal can be more or less strong. So we need to sample the full space of signal to noises. So we've done that as well. And then we need to add more realistic noise, add some non-Gaussian noise and non-stationary noises to the signal. And we've asked the network to do regression, basically, to estimate black hole masses and the final spin of the object which remains afterwards, and the gravitational wave quasi-normal frequencies, right, of the actual oscillations. And so in this network, what we do is a curriculum learning. So basically, in curriculum learning, what you do is you can feed in one data set into the network with a given signal to noise. As the data set learns that level, signal to noise level, you can artificially degrade the signal, right, by adding more noise, and then ask the network to learn again. So this is called curriculum learning, right, where you build up the difficulty in learning the data set, right? But you don't have to start off at a very high difficulty level. Okay. Okay, so this is just some details which you probably don't need to know. So let me just show you what the network looks like itself, because there's some kind of interesting features here. So what's being used are some convolutional layers, right? So this network is being deconstructed into what's called a hierarchical network, hierarchical self-decomposing CNN. So what you do is you use the convolutional layers as a feature extractor called the root layers. And then the output from these root layers are actually passed into what's called leaf layers. And the leaf layers can be used to identify each of these regression parameters that you're trying to get at, right? So the final spin and the quasi-normal frequencies. And the leaf layers are just made up of fully connected layers. And it's these sub-networks, right? It's distinguishing this. It allows you to filter the features that the convolutional layers have deemed to be important into the correct pipelines, right? So some features are not important for the quasi-normal frequencies, for example. And then there's other techniques like erasing some of the layers to enhance propagation of useful information, right? Okay. We can also use a separated neural network to determine the masses, and we do something similar in terms of a root layer with some leaf layers. Okay. So this network we've also implemented as a Bayesian neural network, right? So now with the Bayesian neural network, we're doing some regression problem. Now our distribution is what's being put out at the end, right? So here we have a normal distribution where we're fitting for the mean and the standard deviations. And this is just for the final spin of the final remnant. And then we can sample from this distribution at any stage and say, well, how well is the network learning according to that sample? As I mentioned before, your loss now is a different looking beast altogether, right? It's no longer just a mean squared error term, right? Because now you're using distributions. Okay, so I just want to show you some very intermediate results because I didn't have time to make the full plot because we're still running this at the moment. So these are the relative errors on the estimations of these three parameters in a standard neural network and then in a Bayesian neural network. Okay, these are old results now. But you can see that now we have some error bars on these estimations and the actual value of the estimations don't change that much in a Bayesian neural network either. Okay. Mathematically as well, there is some interesting reasons why the errors on some of the parameters are larger than others. You can relate it back to the network's ability to determine some of those values. And then that can actually lead us back to tweaking the network, right? Tweaking some of those leaf highways so the network can constrain those parameters better. Okay, so those are my examples. Are there any other questions?
So I saw that you had that was called the T-SNE embedded.
T-SNE, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess, how does that compare to like plotting the samples against like the first three principal components?
It's a very similar method, right? It's basically just, it's using a manifold representation, right, to do this 3D representation. I mean, it's not principal component analysis. It is a different algorithm. But it's a similar information distillation, if you like. Right. Yep.
Are you using a parallel T-SNE or
So the T-SNE that's being used here is just the one in scikit-learn. It's not a large data set, yeah. Yeah.
Just to make sure, this last example, the input data is the waveform itself and not the noisy data.
So the waveform itself is the signal and the noise. Yeah, and then at certain moments we augment the noise in the curriculum learning. We add more noise after a certain number of epochs, right? When our loss has reached a certain level and we think the network has learned that level of noise and it's still able to get the signal, we increase the noise. But that noise is randomly added, right, to the sample. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.